It started with a simple mistake, the kind that should have been harmless. A quick description, a hasty assumption, and a single red baseball cap. That was all it took to turn Trevin Jackson's ordinary afternoon into a nightmare. It was a warm evening in Chicago's South Side, the kind where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on, and families gathered on porches to escape the lingering summer heat. Trevon, a 13-year-old with a love for basketball and an easygoing nature, had only stopped at the corner store for a bottle of soda. He had done nothing wrong, but miles away, a different story was unfolding. A thief had just snatched a wallet from a tourist near Washington Park, disappearing before anyone could react. Witnesses scrambled to describe him. A young black boy, maybe 12 or 13, wearing a red cap. It wasn't much, but it was enough for the police scanner to echo the alert through the city. Not far from where Trevon strolled, Officer Greg Larson, a young cop barely 2 years into the force, stood inside a 7-Eleven, responding to a call about a petty theft. The store clerk, still rattled, described the suspect as a young black male in a dark hoodie and basketball shorts, though the details were vague. Larson, fueled more by assumption than evidence, scanned the streets outside the store with sharp eyes. When he spotted Trevon walking by, the pieces fell into place. Not because Trevon actually fit the description, but because he was the easiest target. The moment Larson stepped out onto the sidewalk, his focus locked onto Trevon like a predator zeroing in on prey. Trevon was oblivious at first, too caught up in the rhythm of his surroundings, the chatter of families on their porches, the hum of cars passing, the distant beats of music playing from an open window. But then he noticed the heavy footsteps behind him, the sharp energy of someone closing in fast. Before he could fully register the presence of the officer, Larson raised his can of pepper spray and, without warning, unleashed a burning mist directly into Trevon's face. The pain was instant, searing through his eyes and nose like fire. Trevon let out a choked gasp, his hands flying to his face as his vision blurred, his world shrinking to nothing but blinding agony. His backpack slipped from his shoulder and hit the ground with a soft thud, forgotten as he stumbled backward, struggling to breathe. The acrid burn of the spray mixed with his tears, making it impossible to see anything around him. Panic surged through his body like a bolt of electricity. He didn't understand what was happening, why he was being attacked, why the world had suddenly turned against him. His voice cracked as he tried to speak. Why? What did I do? But the only response was a rough hand yanking his arm, forcing him upright. His body trembled as he tried to pull away, but Larson's grip only tightened. "Stop resisting," the officer barked, his voice filled with the kind of authority that drowned out reason. Trevon wasn't resisting. He was just trying to stay on his feet, to make sense of the nightmare unfolding around him. He barely registered the murmurs of onlookers, the hesitant stares of strangers frozen in place. Some clutched their phones, recording but not intervening. Others simply turned away, unwilling to get involved. Larson didn't hesitate as he dragged Trevon toward the patrol car parked at the curb. The boy's legs barely moved beneath him, his knees buckling with every step. The pain, the fear, the sheer disbelief of what was happening paralyzed him. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, his chest tightening as he struggled against the crushing weight of panic. He tried to explain himself, his voice hoarse and desperate. I was coming from the basketball court. I didn't do anything." The officer didn't listen. He had already decided Trevon was guilty. The car door yanked open, and before Trevon could brace himself, Larson shoved him inside. He landed hard on the worn leather seat, the smell of sweat and metal filling his nose, his hands still clawing at his burning eyes. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the streets like a judge's gavel sealing his fate. From the window, Trevon caught a glimpse of his backpack still lying abandoned on the sidewalk. The zipper slightly open, one of his textbooks poking out. The car started moving. The city blurred past, indifferent to the boy inside who had just lost any sense of safety he once had. Trevon pressed his forehead against the window, his body shaking with quiet, painful sobs. He couldn't see where they were going, couldn't even think beyond the fire in his eyes and the fear gripping his chest. All he knew was that everything had changed in an instant, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The police station felt nothing like the world Trevon knew. The moment he was shoved out of the patrol car, everything changed. The streetlights outside still glowed, cars still passed, and people still walked by. But inside these walls, there was nothing but cold air, harsh fluorescent lights, and a silence that made him feel smaller with every step. The officer leading him didn't speak. He only yanked Trevon forward, forcing the boy to move quickly or risk being dragged. His wrists weren't cuffed, but he felt like they might as well have been. His vision was still hazy, the pepper spray leaving an unbearable sting in his eyes. But no one had given him water. No one had asked if he was okay. He had stopped expecting kindness. They led him down a narrow hallway, lined with doors that all looked the same. Dull gray metal with small windows that revealed nothing inside. When Larson finally stopped, he pulled open one of the heavy doors and pushed Trevon inside. The room was even colder than the rest of the station, the air thick with the smell of old coffee and something metallic. The walls were bare except for a single clock ticking above the door, and in the center sat a table with 2 chairs, one of which had its metal legs scuffed from years of use. Trevon's legs trembled as he hesitated at the doorway, his breath still shaky, before he could decide whether to sit or stand. Larson gave him a shove toward the chair. "Sit," the officer ordered, his voice sharp. Trevon obeyed, gripping the edges of his hoodie like it was the only thing tethering him to reality. He had never been in a police station before, had never even imagined himself in a place like this. He was supposed to be at home, eating dinner with his mom, probably joking about how he had nearly beaten his friend Miles at basketball. Instead, he was here, in this dimly lit room, his skin still burning from the pepper spray, his heart pounding with fear he had never known before. Larson took his time before speaking. He leaned against the table, arms crossed, eyes locked onto Trevon like he was waiting for the boy to break. Trevon avoided his gaze, staring at the clock instead, counting the seconds. Finally, Larson spoke. "Tell me why you ran." Trevon frowned. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "I didn't run." "Don't lie to me." Larson pulled out the other chair and sat down across from him, leaning in slightly. "We got a report about a robbery. You match the description." Trevon's heart clenched. "I was coming from the basketball court," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sure you were." Larson tilted his head, his expression unreadable, like he was studying Trevon as if he were a puzzle missing the right pieces. "So what did you take?" "I didn't take anything," Trevon said, gripping his hoodie tighter. Larson sighed heavily, shaking his head as if this were all some big inconvenience to him. "Look, kid, you might think you can fool me, but I know your type." Those words stung. Your type. Trevon knew exactly what Larson meant. He had heard those words before from store clerks who followed him around the aisles, from neighbors who clutched their purses tighter when he walked by, from teachers who looked at him differently than they did the white kids in his class. Larson continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You were in the area. You fit the description. If you confess now, things will be easier for you." Trevon's throat tightened. "I didn't do anything." Larson exhaled sharply. "Kids like you, always causing trouble, always making things harder than they need to be." The room suddenly felt smaller. Trevon could feel the weight of it pressing against him, suffocating him. He wanted to scream, to fight back, to tell this man that he wasn't some criminal, that he was just a kid who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Nothing he said would matter. Larson stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Fine," he muttered. "You don't want to talk? We can do this the hard way." He turned toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. But before he could touch it, the door swung open. A tall, commanding figure stepped inside, and the energy in the room shifted instantly. He was older, his salt and pepper beard neatly trimmed, his uniform crisp and adorned with badges. Captain Daryl Jackson. Trevon's breath hitched. Even through his blurry vision, He recognized that voice. His father. Larson straightened instinctively, the confidence in his stance faltering for the first time. Captain Jackson, Jackson's eyes swept over the room, his gaze locking onto his son. His usually steady expression darkened as he took in Trevon's appearance. His red, puffy eyes, the dried streaks of tears on his cheeks, the way his shoulders were hunched in defeat. His gaze then snapped to Larson, and his anger became something almost tangible in the air. "What the hell is going on here?" His voice was low, controlled, but it carried a weight that made the walls seem to shrink inward. Larson hesitated. "There was a robbery, sir. The suspect is my son." Jackson's words cut through the air like a blade. Larson paled. "Sir, I didn't know." Jackson took a slow step forward. "You didn't know," he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "So you just assumed?" Larson opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Jackson turned to Trevon. His expression softened for just a moment. "Son, are you okay?" Trevon nodded weakly, but his father knew he wasn't. Then, Jackson turned back to Larson. His voice was ice. "You're done." The words hung in the air. Larson's mouth opened in protest, but he seemed to think better of it. "You're fired." Larson stood frozen, his entire world crumbling around him. Jackson ignored him, moving to his son. He knelt in front of Trevon, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. "Let's go home," he said, his voice firm, but gentle. For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Trevon felt safe. As Captain Daryl Jackson led his son out of the interrogation room, the tension in the station was almost suffocating. Officers who had once moved with ease through the halls now stepped aside, their eyes flickering between the boy and the man whose presence commanded authority. Trevon kept his head down, his swollen eyes still burning, his breath uneven, his mind a tangled mess of emotions. Fear, relief, exhaustion. His father's grip on his shoulder was firm, steady, reassuring in a way that no words could be. Trevon felt like he was walking through a fog, his thoughts struggling to catch up with the reality that, just moments ago, he had been treated like a criminal, like someone who didn't deserve basic humanity, all because of the color of his skin and the assumptions that came with it. Jackson stopped at the front desk, his voice low but sharp as he addressed the officer behind it. "I need my son's belongings." The clerk, a younger officer who had clearly heard the commotion, scrambled to comply, his hands fumbling slightly as he retrieved Trevon's backpack. Jackson took it without a word, slinging it over his own shoulder before guiding his son toward the exit. The heavy station doors pushed open and the night air hit Trevon's face like a cool wave, washing away the stale scent of the police station, but not the memory of what had happened inside. The streetlights glowed against the pavement, casting long shadows as Jackson led his son to his car, a sleek black SUV parked just outside. He unlocked the doors, and Trevon climbed in without hesitation, sinking into the passenger seat as if the fabric itself could swallow him whole. He heard his father close the driver's door, but neither of them spoke right away. The engine hummed to life, but Jackson didn't pull away from the curb. Instead, he exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel tightly before turning to face his son. "Trevon," he started, his voice softer than it had been in the station, but still carrying the weight of everything that had just unfolded. Trevon stared out the window, watching as people moved along the sidewalks, as if the world hadn't just shifted beneath his feet. He didn't want to talk, didn't want to relive it, but he knew his father wouldn't let this moment pass without addressing it. "Look at me, son," Jackson said. Reluctantly, Trevon turned his head, meeting his father's eyes. They weren't just angry, they were pained, filled with something deeper, something that went beyond tonight. "I need you to understand something," Jackson said, his jaw tightening. "What happened back there, that should never have happened. But it did, and it wasn't an accident." Trevon swallowed hard. He had known that, had felt it in the way Larson had looked at him, had heard it in the officer's voice when he said, "Your type. You didn't do anything wrong." Jackson continued, his voice steady. "You were just a black boy walking down the street, and that was enough for him." Trevon's fingers curled into fists in his lap, his breath shaky. He had always known the world wasn't fair. His father had warned him. His mother had too. But knowing it and living it were two different things. He had never been afraid of police before. He had grown up seeing his father in uniform, had watched him leave for work every morning believing that the badge meant protection, that it meant fairness. But tonight, none of that had mattered. Larson hadn't seen him as a person, he had seen him as a problem to be handled. I kept thinking, Trevon finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, that no one would believe me. His father's grip on the wheel tightened. They wouldn't have, Jackson admitted, his voice laced with something Trevon had never heard from him before, defeat. If I hadn't walked in, they would have made you confess to something you didn't do. The words hit Trevon like a punch to the chest. He had known it, but hearing his father say it made it real in a way that was almost unbearable. For a moment, silence filled the car. Then Jackson exhaled, running a hand over his face before shifting gears and pulling away from the curb. "We're going home," he said simply. But Trevon could tell there was more to it than that. His father wasn't just talking about the drive. He was talking about the weight they both carried now. The reality that Trevon had crossed a threshold he could never go back from. The ride home was quiet, the streets passing in a blur of headlights and traffic lights. Trevon stared at the city, at the world that had once felt familiar but now felt different, as if something had shifted permanently. His father didn't speak again until they pulled into their driveway. The house dark, except for the porch light his mother always left on when they were out late. As soon as Trevon stepped inside, the warmth of home wrapped around him, a stark contrast to the sterile, suffocating atmosphere of the station. His mother appeared almost instantly, her face tense with worry, her eyes scanning him as if searching for visible wounds. "Baby," she breathed, rushing forward, pulling him into a tight hug. Trevon stiffened at first, but then the tension melted away, and he let himself sink into her embrace, the familiar scent of her perfume grounding him. "What happened?" she demanded, pulling back just enough to study his face. "Who did this to you?" Jackson set Trevon's backpack down on the counter. "Greg Larson," he said, the name dripping with controlled anger. His wife's face darkened. "That rookie?" "Not anymore," Jackson muttered. "I fired him on the spot." Trevon's mother exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "That's not enough." Jackson nodded. "I know." His voice carried a promise, one that Trevon wasn't sure he fully understood yet. His mother cupped Trevon's face gently, her thumb brushing over the drying streaks of tears. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Trevon hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know." It was the truth. She pulled him in for another hug, whispering, "You're home now, baby. You're safe." But was he? As Trevon lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he replayed every moment of that evening over and over again, the way Larson had grabbed him, the way the pepper spray had burned like fire, the way no one on the street had stopped to help, the way the interrogation room had felt like a cage, and most of all, the way his father had looked at him, not just with anger, but with something deeper, a sadness that came from knowing that no matter how high you climbed, no matter how hard you worked, no matter how many good things you did, there would always be people who saw you as nothing more than a suspect. His father had always told him to be careful, to be respectful, to never give anyone a reason to see him as a threat, but tonight had proven that sometimes that didn't matter. Morning came, but Trevon didn't feel like himself. He moved through the house in a daze, his mother watching him carefully, his father making phone calls in his office. Trevon didn't know what would happen next. Would Larson face any real consequences? Would he move to another precinct? Get another job? Hurt someone else? Would Trevon ever walk through his neighborhood without feeling the phantom weight of a police officer's hand on his arm? He didn't have the answers. But as he sat at the kitchen table, his mother setting a plate of pancakes in front of him, his father walking in with a determined look on his face, Trevon realized something. He had survived. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward something bigger. The air inside the Cook County Courthouse was thick with murmurs, the kind that filled a room when everyone believed they already knew how the story would end. A young black man stood at the defendant's table, hands in his pockets, his chin lifted just enough to show he wasn't afraid. Malcolm Porter, 19 years old, was accused of grand theft auto and evading arrest. His name had already been whispered through the halls of the courthouse. A case most assumed would be decided in minutes. But to Judge Howard Litchfield, Malcolm was just another face in a long line of young men whose futures had been placed in his hands. Judge Litchfield, an older man with a reputation for impatience, leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lazily against the polished wood of his bench. His expression barely concealed his disinterest as he peered over the rim of his glasses, eyeing Malcolm with an amused smirk. "You think you're some kind of legal expert, kid?" he mused, his voice carrying a dry amusement. "This isn't a high school debate tournament." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They were all in on the joke. But Malcolm wasn't laughing. For years, he had prepared for this. Not this exact moment, but moments like it. While other kids memorized sports stats, he memorized case law. While his friends spent hours on video games, he simulated trials in his mind, debating legal precedents and court strategies. His mother, Barbara Porter, had worked as a paralegal for over 25 years, and every evening at the dinner table, she shared stories of cases gone wrong. Prosecutors cutting corners, judges playing favorites, defense attorneys barely putting up a fight. Malcolm had listened, learned, and absorbed everything. By the time he was 14, he could break down a trial better than most second-year law students. But none of that mattered to Judge Litchfield. To him, Malcolm was just another young black man in trouble, another case to clear before lunch. "Let's make this quick," the judge sighed, flipping open the case file. "I've got a tea time at 3. The audience chuckled again, but this time Malcolm allowed himself a faint smirk, because Litchfield had already made his first mistake. The courtroom just hadn't noticed yet. The case against Malcolm prosecutor Stephen Yates rose from his seat, the air of authority surrounding him. His suit was tailored, his tie knotted with precision, and his voice carried the confidence of a man who had done this 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Malcolm Porter, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2023 Dodge Charger, reported missing just hours before his arrest. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to evade capture before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The case sounded airtight. Judge Litchfield glanced at Malcolm, unimpressed. "Go on." Yates walked toward the jury box, his polished shoes clicking against the floor with a measured confidence. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding," he continued, locking eyes with Malcolm for the first time. "That Mr. Porter is just an unfortunate victim of circumstance. But, let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. Judge Litchfield leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand. Malcolm didn't blink. Yates flipped through his notes before continuing. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Ryan Calloway, who personally saw the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The vehicle was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book." Judge Litchfield exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Sounds straightforward to me." And for most people in the room, it probably did. But Malcolm had spent too many years studying trials not to see the cracks in the case. Still, he waited. Judge Litchfield tapped his gavel. "All right, let's hear the defense's response." At the defense table, Rachel Carmichael, Malcolm's court-appointed public defender, rose hesitantly. She had barely spoken since the trial began. "Your Honor, my client." Malcolm placed a steady hand on her arm. A silent request. She hesitated, then sat back down. And for the first time, Malcolm spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." The room went silent. Litchfield raised an eyebrow, his amusement clear. "You'll what?" Malcolm's voice remained calm and steady. "I'll be defending myself." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Yates chuckled, shaking his head. This should be interesting. But nobody was laughing when Malcolm took his first step forward because everything was about to change. Malcolm takes control. Malcolm adjusted his stance, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Then, finally, he spoke. "Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Yates raised an eyebrow, folding his arms. "Go ahead." Malcolm took a slow step forward. "You said Officer Calloway personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Yates sighed, already impatient. "That's right." "And that testimony is written in his report?" "Of course." Malcolm nodded, then turned to Judge Litchfield. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." Litchfield squinted. "On what grounds?" For the first time, Malcolm pulled his hands from his pockets, his fingers gesturing toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Calloway never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A flicker of confusion crossed Yates's face. "What are you talking about?" Malcolm took another step forward. "Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Calloway's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history, but..." He let the word hang. "I have a feeling it won't." Now, the gallery stirred, whispers spreading rapidly. Judge Litchfield frowned, glancing toward Yates. The prosecutor cleared his throat. His jaw tightened. "That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional?" Malcolm gave a small, almost casual shrug. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't..." He let the sentence trail off. Litchfield studied Malcolm for a long moment, then turned to Yates. "Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Yates hesitated. The pause was long enough. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. And most importantly, Judge Litchfield noticed. Malcolm took a quiet breath. He had spent years watching trials, studying prosecutors, learning their tactics, understanding how they played the system. And there was one thing he knew without a doubt. If Yates was confident in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Judge Litchfield sighed, rubbing his temple. Yates finally shook his head. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The weight of the moment hung in the air as Malcolm Porter stood firm, his confidence unwavering. He had just called into question the testimony of Officer Ryan Calloway, the prosecution's key witness, and now the courtroom was no longer chuckling. Judge Litchfield's face was unreadable as he glanced toward Prosecutor Stephen Yates, whose once polished demeanor was beginning to crack. Yates cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for a way to regain control. "Your Honor," Yates began, his voice measured but with a hint of tension. "While we wait for the officer's GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Malcolm nodded slightly, his face unreadable. "That's true," he admitted, then took a step forward, turning to the jury. "But let's talk about that evidence for a second." Litchfield raised an eyebrow, motioning for him to continue. Malcolm shifted his gaze between the 12 jurors, locking eyes with each of them as he spoke. His tone remained steady, controlled. The prosecution wants you to believe that just because my fingerprints were found in the car, I must have stolen it. That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically for a moment. He let a brief pause hang in the air before continuing. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then decide it's not for you and put it back on the rack. A few hours later, someone else steals that same jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you committed the crime? A few jurors exchanged glances, the first sign of doubt flickering in their eyes. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. Yates straightened his posture, his jaw tightening. That's not the same thing, he countered, attempting to maintain his authority. Malcolm didn't look at him. Instead, he kept his focus on the jury. Actually, it is. The room stilled. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven just a few hours before it was reported stolen. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door, because it was already unlocked. A few eyebrows in the jury box raised. I didn't think much of it. I didn't take the car. I didn't drive it. I didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity. He let that sink in, then turned back toward Yates. So I ask you, does touching something make you a criminal? A hush fell over the room. Yates hesitated for just a moment too long. The courtroom felt different now. The laughter from earlier had completely disappeared. Judge Litchfield sat back in his chair, studying Malcolm with an expression that was no longer amused, but rather intrigued. Malcolm took a breath and pressed forward. And while we're on the subject of evidence, let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done. He turned toward the judge. Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify? Litchfield blinked, caught off guard. He glanced at Yates. The prosecutor hesitated, then reluctantly answered. No. Malcolm pressed his lips together, nodding slightly as if that was all he needed to hear. So, let me get this straight, he said, his voice calm but firm. The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. No chance for me to cross-examine them. No opportunity to ask about the chain of custody. No way to challenge the accuracy of the analysis. Yates shifted, his confidence visibly shaken. Malcolm let his words settle before delivering his final point. Interesting. Judge Litchfield sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had assumed this would be a routine case, an easy conviction, but it was becoming clear that Malcolm Porter wasn't an ordinary defendant. And he wasn't finished yet. The turning point. Malcolm took another slow step forward, his voice still steady but carrying more weight now. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle. Judge Litchfield frowned. The owner? Malcolm nodded. Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the Dodge Charger. He provided a statement to the police that, for some reason, was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. He turned to Yates. And I think I know why. The prosecutor's jaw clenched. He knew exactly what was coming. Malcolm didn't wait for him to object. Instead, he reached into his file, pulled out a printed transcript, and began reading aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off, but it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Malcolm held the paper up for everyone to see. This is from the original police report, the same report that the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. He turned back to Judge Litchfield, his voice unwavering. The arresting officer omitted this detail from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even match the description of the real thief, was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury members exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Yates stepped forward, scrambling for control. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle." But Malcolm shook his head. "No, I wasn't." His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. "I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home after grabbing snacks with my friends. I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything." His next words landed like a hammer. "The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions." The tension in the room was palpable. Judge Litchfield let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. The case was unraveling fast, and everyone knew it. Malcolm turned back to the jury, making his final argument. The real suspect got away that night, but the officers found a black kid in the same general area and decided that was close enough. Silence. The weight of that statement lingered in the air. Judge Litchfield cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" Yates was stiff, his face flushed with frustration. "No, Your Honor." A long pause. Then, finally, Judge Litchfield leaned forward. His next words would stay with everyone in that room. "Case dismissed." A beat of stunned silence, then chaos. Half the courtroom erupted, some in disbelief, others in quiet relief. The gallery stirred, reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Malcolm didn't move right away. He let the moment settle. He let the reality sink in. And then, slowly, he turned and walked toward the exit. But just as he reached the door, Judge Litchfield spoke again. "Mr. Porter." Malcolm stopped but didn't turn. Litchfield hesitated, then finally said, "You should consider law school." Malcolm smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Malcolm Porter stepped outside the Cook County Courthouse, and the world erupted in flashing cameras and shouting voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones thrust forward, eager to capture the story of the teenager who had just outmaneuvered the system. "Malcolm, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? How does it feel to outsmart a seasoned prosecutor? What are you going to do next?" He barely acknowledged them, pulling the hood of his sweatshirt over his head and moving through the crowd with quiet determination. He had never cared for the spectacle. This wasn't about proving how smart he was. At the bottom of the courthouse steps, Barbara Porter stood with her arms crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment she simply looked at her son, not as a defendant but as a young man who had fought back and won. "Boy, you scared me half to death," Malcolm chuckled, rubbing the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." Barbara sighed, then pulled him into a tight hug. "You always were the stubborn one," she murmured against his shoulder. For a moment, the world around them disappeared. The flashing cameras, the shouting reporters, the murmurs of the onlookers, none of it mattered. Across the street, standing beside his car, Judge Howard Litchfield watched. His posture had changed. The arrogance was gone. The amusement in his eyes from earlier had been replaced with something else. Recognition, maybe even regret. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But Malcolm had made the system look at itself. And for once, it blinked first. The weight of everything settled in as Malcolm and his mother walked toward their car. He kept his head down, avoiding the cameras, the microphones, and the endless questions being hurled in his direction. Inside his mind, the real conversation was beginning. For every case like his, where someone had the knowledge and the courage to fight back, how many others didn't? How many had been convicted, not because of evidence, but because of bias? How many had been pressured into plea deals because they didn't have the resources to defend themselves? How many were sitting in jail right now, serving time for crimes they didn't commit, simply because they didn't have the chance to expose the cracks in the system like he did? His case had been dismissed. But the fight wasn't over. Not for him, not for people like him. He climbed into the passenger seat as his mother started the car. The radio crackled to life, already tuned into the news. And in breaking news, 19-year-old Malcolm Porter shocked the courtroom today when he dismantled the prosecution's case against him, ultimately leading to the dismissal of all charges. The case has sparked debate about the justice system, particularly the reliance on officer testimony and forensic evidence without sufficient scrutiny. Barbara turned off the radio, shaking her head. "You ready to talk about what's next?" Malcolm stared out the window for a long moment. "I already know what's next." His mother gave him a knowing look. "Law school?" He nodded. "Not just for me," he said, "but for the people who never had the chance to fight back." Barbara smiled, a small, proud smile. "I figured." She put the car in drive, and as they pulled away from the courthouse, Malcolm felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, determination, a sense that he had only just begun. The news of Malcolm's case spread quickly. Within days, his story was everywhere. Social media, television, newspapers. Some called him a genius. Others called him lucky. But Malcolm didn't believe in luck. He believed in preparation. His fight wasn't just about one case. It was about all of them. A week later, he sat across from Professor Daniel Kingston, one of the most respected legal minds in Chicago, inside his office at the University of Chicago School of Law. "So," Kingston said, folding his hands together as he studied Malcolm carefully, "you want to be a lawyer?" Malcolm met his gaze without hesitation. "I don't just want to be a lawyer," he said. "I want to change the system." Kingston's eyebrows raised slightly, but there was no skepticism in his eyes, only curiosity. "That's a big goal," he said. Malcolm leaned forward. "So was getting my case dismissed," he said. "And I did that in one day." The professor chuckled softly. "Fair point." He picked up a pen, twirling it between his fingers. "You know, most people go to law school first, then learn the realities of how the system works." Malcolm nodded. "I learned it the other way around." Kingston smiled. "Then you'll fit right in." That night, Malcolm sat at his desk, staring at a blank legal pad. His case had been about more than just proving his innocence. It was about exposing a system that was flawed, biased, and built to favor those with power. And he wasn't about to walk away now. He picked up his pen and began to write. Step 1, get into law school. Step 2, graduate. Step 3, defend the people who don't have a voice. Step 4, change the system. The road ahead was long. But Malcolm had never been afraid of a fight. And this time, he wouldn't just be defending himself. He'd be defending all the people who had been silenced, all the people who deserved justice but had never gotten it. As he wrote, he thought back to the final words Judge Litchfield had said to him in the courtroom. "You should consider law school." A smirk crossed Malcolm's lips. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. The next morning, Malcolm received an email. Subject, Scholarship Opportunity, University of Chicago Law School. From Dean of Admissions. He opened it, and as he read the words inside, he knew. This was just the beginning. Malcolm Porter had won his case. But now, he was ready to win something even bigger, justice. For everyone. Eddie Carter was a young black boy who knew the sting of ridicule all too well. At school, his low test scores made him an easy target for classmates who jeered and labeled him Empty Eddie. As one of the few black students in a predominantly white school during the 1960s, Eddie faced not only academic struggles, but also the weight of racial prejudice. Day after day, he endured their mockery, the laughter echoing in his mind. and convincing him he might truly be the failure they claimed. But behind the taunts and doubt, Eddie's story was only beginning. In the sprawling neighborhoods of Chicago during the 1960s, a young boy named Eddie Carter faced challenges that seemed insurmountable. Life wasn't just hard, it felt like an endless uphill climb. Eddie was a small, quiet child with round glasses and a nervous disposition that made him a target for ridicule at Lincoln Avenue Elementary School. Every day he trudged to class, dreading what lay ahead. Eddie's struggles with schoolwork were well known. His classmates, especially the confident ones like Sam and Lisa, never missed an opportunity to point out his low test scores. They breezed through spelling bees and arithmetic drills, earning gold stars and teacher praise, while Eddie sat at his desk, scribbling answers that rarely made sense. His scores were almost always in single digits, earning him the cruel nickname Empty Eddie. The laughter stung, but what hurt most was the belief that began to take root in Eddie's own mind. "I'm just dumb," he confided to his mother Clara one evening after another dismal day at school. "I'll never be good at anything." Clara Carter, a single mother raising Eddie and his older brother Malcolm, refused to let her son give in to despair. Despite her exhaustion from working 2 jobs, cleaning offices during the day and washing clothes at night, Clara always made time to encourage her boys. "Eddie," she would say, crouching down to meet his eyes, "God doesn't make mistakes. You've got something special inside you, and one day the world will see it. But you have to believe in it first." Clara's unwavering optimism came from her own battles with adversity. Born in rural Mississippi, she had grown up in a household marked by poverty and hardship. At just 16, she fled to Chicago in search of a better life, only to find herself in a different kind of struggle. Her husband, whom she had trusted to help build a stable home, turned out to have another family in a neighboring city. When Clara discovered the betrayal, she packed her bags and left with her 2 young boys, determined to raise them on her own terms. Life as a single mother in the big city was anything but easy. Clara often worked herself to the bone, scrubbing floors and ironing shirts for meager wages. Still, she never let her boys see her cry or hear her worries about paying rent or putting food on the table. To Eddie and Malcolm, she was a pillar of strength, a woman who seemed capable of overcoming anything. But Eddie's struggles at school weighed heavily on her heart. She had no illusions about the challenges her son faced as a black boy in a predominantly white school. Racism wasn't just an undercurrent, it was a daily reality. Teachers often dismissed Eddie's potential, and some even seemed to take a perverse satisfaction in his failures. One teacher, Mrs. Collins, would raise her eyebrows at his low test scores and say things like, "Well, at least he's consistent," in a tone that dripped with condescension. The other children followed suit, mocking Eddie whenever they had the chance. During recess, he was often left alone, his attempts to join in on games met with laughter or outright rejection. Sam, the class clown, seemed to take particular delight in making Eddie the butt of his jokes. "Hey, Empty Eddie!" he'd shout across the playground. "Did you even try on that math test? Or did you just draw pictures again?" Eddie tried to shrug off the taunts, but they left scars. The worst day came when he scored a 6 on a math test, his highest grade in weeks, and Sam announced it to the entire class. "Hey everyone, look! Eddie got a whole 6 points this time. What a genius!" The room erupted in laughter, and Eddie wished he could disappear into his chair. That evening, when Eddie came home with tears in his eyes, Clara knew something had to change. She couldn't stand to see her son so defeated. But what could she do? She had little education herself, having dropped out of school at a young age to work. Still, Clara believed that her boys deserved better, and she was determined to find a way. One day, as she watched Eddie struggle to read a simple passage from his homework, she noticed something peculiar. He squinted at the page, tilting his head as if trying to bring the words into focus. "Eddie, can you see the letters clearly?" she asked. Eddie shrugged. "Not really. They're kinda blurry." That was all Clara needed to hear. The next day, she took Eddie to a local optometrist, a trip that cost her nearly a week's wages. The doctor examined Eddie and confirmed that he had severe vision problems. "He needs glasses, ma'am," the doctor said. "Strong ones." The glasses Clara picked out were second-hand, purchased from a thrift store downtown. They were too big for Eddie's small face, and the frames were slightly bent, but when he put them on, the world came into focus for the first time. "I can see," Eddie exclaimed, staring at the fine print in his textbook with wide eyes. It wasn't a miracle cure, but it was a start. With his new glasses, Eddie found it easier to concentrate in class. Slowly but surely, his grades began to improve. One day, he scored a 15 on a math test, a modest number by most standards. But for Eddie, it was a triumph. Clara celebrated the milestone as if he had won a championship trophy. "See? I told you, Eddie. You're smarter than you think." But the road ahead was still full of obstacles. The bullying didn't stop, and Eddie's self-doubt lingered. Yet for the first time, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as hopeless as he'd thought. Clara's faith in him became his anchor, pulling him through the rough waters of adolescence. And so, the boy who had once been labeled Empty Eddie began to find his footing. It was a long journey, but with every small victory, Eddie inched closer to discovering the brilliance that had been inside him all along. As Eddie Carter entered middle school, the challenges only grew tougher. While his new glasses had improved his ability to focus, the underlying issues of self-esteem and systemic bias didn't disappear overnight. At Roosevelt Middle School in the heart of Chicago, Eddie continued to encounter the mocking laughter of classmates and the low expectations of some teachers. But amidst the obstacles, he was beginning to find flickers of hope, sparked by his mother's relentless encouragement and an unexpected source of inspiration. One Sunday morning, Clara woke Eddie and his older brother Malcolm earlier than usual. "We're going to church," she announced, handing them neatly pressed shirts. Clara had always been a spiritual woman, and though her work schedule often made it hard to attend services, she wanted to reconnect with the sense of community and strength that faith had always brought her. Eddie wasn't thrilled. "Do we have to?" he groaned, dragging his feet as they walked to the small Baptist church a few blocks away. But once inside, he found himself mesmerized. The minister, Reverend Paul Jefferson, was a commanding presence, with a voice that seemed to fill every corner of the room. That day, he shared a story about a young boy from humble beginnings who overcame incredible odds to become a doctor. As Reverend Jefferson spoke, Eddie felt something stir inside him. He imagined himself in the story, wearing a white coat and saving lives. The idea seemed almost laughable. Him, a doctor. Yet for the first time, he felt a glimmer of possibility. When they returned home, Eddie hesitated before turning to his mother. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think I want to be a doctor someday." Clara's face lit up. "A doctor? Eddie, that's wonderful." She hugged him tightly. "If that's what you want to do, then we'll figure out a way to make it happen." From that day forward, something shifted in Eddie. He began to approach his schoolwork with a new sense of purpose. Clara, determined to support his dream, made some changes at home. Television, which had been Eddie and Malcolm's favorite pastime, was suddenly restricted. "2 shows a week," she declared one evening, turning off the TV. "The rest of your time will be spent learning." The boys protested, but Clara was firm. She handed them library cards and announced, "You'll read 2 books a week and write a report on each one, and don't think I won't check." The first few weeks were a struggle. Eddie wasn't used to reading for pleasure, and the reports felt like extra homework. But over time, something amazing happened. He discovered a love for learning. Trips to the library became an adventure, as Eddie devoured books on science, history, and geography. One day, he stumbled upon a thick book about the human brain. He flipped through its pages, captivated by the complex diagrams and fascinating descriptions of how the mind worked. "Did you know the brain has billions of nerve cells?" he asked Malcolm one evening, holding up the book. His brother rolled his eyes, but Eddie didn't care. He was hooked. At school, Eddie's newfound curiosity began to show. During a science lesson, his teacher brought in a small black rock and asked if anyone could identify it. The room was silent until Eddie tentatively raised his hand. "I think it's obsidian," he said. "It's formed when lava cools really quickly." The teacher stared at him in surprise. "That's correct, Eddie. How did you know that?" Eddie shrugged, a shy smile tugging at his lips. "I read it in a book." For the first time, Eddie experienced the thrill of being seen as smart. It was a small moment, but it planted a seed of confidence that began to grow. His grades improved steadily, and he even started participating in class discussions. When the annual spelling bee rolled around, Eddie shocked everyone by not only qualifying, but winning the competition. As he stood on stage clutching his trophy, he spotted Clara in the audience, clapping so hard it seemed her hands might fall off. But not everyone was happy about Eddie's success. Mrs. Collins, the same teacher who had once dismissed him, couldn't hide her disdain. During the school's end-of-year awards ceremony, she reluctantly announced that Eddie had been named the most improved student. As she handed him the certificate, she muttered under her breath, "It's a shame the other kids didn't try harder." Clara, sitting in the audience, heard the comment and clenched her fists. She knew that no matter how hard Eddie worked, some people would always see him as less than because of his skin color. That night, as they walked home, she turned to Eddie and said, "You're going to face people like her your whole life, but don't you ever let them make you feel small. You are just as good, no better, than anyone else." Clara's words stayed with Eddie, even as he moved on to high school. By now, he was a different boy than the one who had once been mocked as Empty Eddie. He was determined, curious, and full of dreams, but he also carried with him the scars of those early years, along with a burning desire to prove everyone wrong. At Washington High School, Eddie faced a new set of challenges. The school was larger, and while there were more students who looked like him, the social pressures were just as intense. Eddie's old clothes and second-hand shoes became a source of ridicule among some of his peers. One boy, Marcus, teased him mercilessly about his unfashionable outfits. "You're never going to fit in looking like that," Marcus sneered one day. Eddie's face burned with shame, and he ran home to Clara, begging for new clothes. But money was tight, and Clara had to make tough choices. She bought him a pair of pants from a discount store, but Eddie hated them. "I can't wear this," he shouted, frustrated by the constant feeling of being less than. Clara's patience snapped. "Eddie, listen to me," she said firmly. "It's not the clothes that matter. It's what's inside you. Don't waste your time trying to impress people who don't care about you." Though Eddie didn't want to admit it, her words hit home. He began to realize that the opinions of others didn't define him. Instead of focusing on fitting in, he poured his energy into his studies. He joined the school's science club and began experimenting with chemistry sets and biology kits. His fascination with the brain deepened, and he started dreaming of one day becoming a neurosurgeon. By the time Eddie graduated high school, he had transformed from the boy everyone had underestimated into a young man full of potential. Clara watched with pride as her son walked across the stage to accept his diploma. In that moment, all the sacrifices she had made felt worth it. Eddie's journey was far from over, but for the first time, he believed he could achieve anything he set his mind to. Eddie Carter's high school graduation was just the beginning of a journey that would test his resilience, intellect, and faith in ways he couldn't yet imagine. With a heart full of dreams and a determination fueled by his mother's sacrifices, Eddie set his sights on college. He had worked tirelessly to earn scholarships, and his efforts paid off when he was accepted to the prestigious University of Michigan on a full academic scholarship. Moving to Ann Arbor was both thrilling and daunting. Eddie was stepping into a world where the competition was fierce and expectations were sky high. He quickly realized that excelling in college would be a far cry from succeeding in high school. His classes were demanding, and the workload often felt overwhelming. Chemistry, in particular, became his nemesis. The complex equations and formulas seemed impossible to master, and Eddie began to doubt himself once more. One evening, as he sat in the library surrounded by textbooks, frustration bubbled over. "Maybe I'm not cut out for this," he muttered, burying his face in his hands. His girlfriend, Valerie, who had joined him at the library, placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Valerie was a kind and pragmatic nursing student who had a knack for calming Eddie's nerves. "You're not giving up," she said firmly. "You're one of the smartest people I know. You just need to figure out how to study in a way that works for you." With Valerie's encouragement, Eddie developed a new approach. He began studying late into the night, creating detailed flashcards and diagrams to help him visualize the material. His persistence started to pay off, and his grades improved. By the end of his sophomore year, he had not only conquered chemistry, but had also rekindled his dream of becoming a doctor. But Eddie's path wasn't without setbacks. During his junior year, he faced an unexpected personal tragedy when Valerie suffered a miscarriage. The loss devastated both of them, but Valerie's quiet strength helped Eddie navigate his grief. "You're going to do great things, Eddie," she told him one evening as they sat on the steps of the campus chapel. "Don't let this stop you." Those words stayed with Eddie as he pushed through the rest of college. When he graduated with honors and was accepted into Johns Hopkins University's medical program, he felt the weight of all he had accomplished and all that lay ahead. Johns Hopkins was renowned as one of the top medical schools in the country, and Eddie knew he would have to work harder than ever to prove himself. His time at Johns Hopkins was both exhilarating and grueling. Eddie's passion for neurology grew as he immersed himself in the study of the brain, a mysterious and awe-inspiring organ. But the challenges of medical school often felt insurmountable. Long nights in the lab, grueling rounds at the hospital, and the constant pressure to outperform his peers took a toll on his mental and physical health. Despite the pressure, Eddie's natural talent began to shine. During a residency rotation, he encountered a patient who had been experiencing severe seizures. The patient, a young boy named Danny, had tried every available treatment, but nothing worked. Eddie, still a resident at the time, suggested a daring solution: a hemispherectomy, a procedure that involved removing the seizure-prone half of the brain. It was a risky operation, one that had rarely been attempted, but Eddie was convinced it was the boy's best chance. The lead surgeon, Dr. Reynolds, was skeptical. "That's an incredibly dangerous procedure, Carter," he said. "If something goes wrong, it could cost him his life, or leave him paralyzed." "I understand the risks," Eddie replied, his voice steady. "But I've studied the research. If we do this right, Danny could have a chance at a normal life." After much deliberation, the surgical team agreed to move forward, with Eddie assisting in the operation. The night before the procedure, Eddie stayed up praying and reviewing every detail of the surgery. He knew that failure wasn't an option. The surgery lasted over 12 hours. The tension in the operating room was palpable as Eddie worked alongside Dr. Reynolds to carefully remove the affected portion of Danny's brain. When the final suture was placed, the team held their breath, waiting to see if the boy would wake up. Hours later, Danny opened his eyes. He moved his fingers, then his toes, and finally spoke a single word: "Mom." The room erupted in relief and joy. The surgery was a success, and Danny's seizures stopped completely. Eddie had proven not only his skill, but also his courage in taking risks for the sake of his patients. Word of Eddie's success spread quickly, and he began to earn a reputation as a brilliant young neurosurgeon. But with success came new challenges. Some of his colleagues, particularly older, more established doctors, were dismissive of his accomplishments. One senior surgeon, Dr. Callahan, seemed particularly resentful. "Don't get cocky, Carter," he said one day during rounds. "You're still just a resident. You have a long way to go before you can call yourself exceptional." Eddie took the criticism in stride, but it only fueled his drive to excel. He continued to push the boundaries of what was possible in neurosurgery, taking on complex cases that others wouldn't touch. One of the most remarkable moments of his career came when he was invited to Germany to consult on a case involving conjoined twins. The twins, Maria and Matteo, were joined at the head, and separating them would be one of the most challenging surgeries ever attempted. Eddie initially hesitated to take on the case. The risks were enormous, and the likelihood of success was slim. But the parents, desperate for a chance to give their children independent lives, pleaded with him to try. "You're their only hope, Doctor." "Carter," Maria and Matteo's mother said, tears streaming down her face. "Please." Eddie couldn't say no. For weeks, he and a team of 50 medical professionals meticulously planned the procedure. They rehearsed every step, accounting for every possible complication. On the day of the surgery, the hospital was abuzz with tension. Eddie led the team with steady hands and unwavering focus, working for over 22 hours to separate the twins. When the final cut was made, the room erupted into applause. The twins were successfully separated, and though their recovery would be long, both were expected to thrive. Eddie's achievement was hailed as a medical miracle, cementing his reputation as one of the most talented neurosurgeons of his time. But through it all, Eddie never forgot where he came from. He often thought of his mother, Clara, and the sacrifices she had made to give him a chance at a better life. On the day he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his contributions to medicine, he invited Clara to stand beside him. As he held the medal in his hands, he turned to her and said, "This is as much yours as it is mine, Mom. You believed in me when no one else did." Clara, with tears in her eyes, simply said, "I always knew you'd make it, Eddie." Eddie Carter's journey was a testament to the power of resilience, love, and determination. From the bullied boy who was once called Empty Eddie to a world-renowned neurosurgeon, he proved that no obstacle is insurmountable when you have the courage to dream. Part 1. Stranded in the heat. It was a scorching summer afternoon in Austin, Texas. The sun blazed mercilessly over an empty stretch of rural road where a luxurious black SUV sat motionless, one tire completely flat. Inside, Henry Callahan, a successful entrepreneur in his early 60s, tapped his steering wheel impatiently. His air conditioning was barely holding back the relentless heat, and his phone screen displayed the dreaded words, "No signal." Henry wasn't used to situations like this. In his world, problems were solved with a phone call, a quick order given, and someone else would handle the mess. But here, on this deserted road, surrounded by endless fields and baking asphalt, he was utterly alone. Stepping out of the SUV, Henry squinted into the distance, sweat already forming on his brow. He sighed deeply and leaned against the car, feeling frustration bubbling in his chest. Then, like an apparition rising from the shimmering heat, a figure appeared on the horizon. A young boy, no older than 14, wearing a faded baseball cap, dusty shorts, and scuffed sneakers, walked toward him. His backpack swung loosely from one shoulder, and his eyes shone with quiet determination. "Got a flat tire, mister?" the boy called out as he approached. Henry straightened up, feeling a mix of relief and skepticism. "Yeah." "Do you know how to fix one?" The boy nodded confidently. "Sure do. My dad showed me how last summer. You got a spare in the back?" Henry hesitated but eventually popped the trunk, revealing the spare tire and a dusty toolkit. The boy set down his backpack and knelt by the flat tire, his movements purposeful and sure. Henry stood nearby, feeling strangely useless. He wasn't used to standing by while someone else worked, especially a kid. But as he watched the boy work, loosening lug nuts and maneuvering the jack, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration. "What's your name, kid?" Henry asked. "Jason," the boy replied without looking up. Almost done, mister. Won't take long. True to his word, Jason worked swiftly. In less than 15 minutes, the spare tire was securely in place. Jason wiped his hands on his shorts and stood up, giving Henry a small, proud smile. All set, mister. You're good to go. Henry reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He thumbed through a stack of crisp bills and held out a few 20s. Here, kid. Take this. You've earned it. But Jason took a step back, shaking his head firmly. No, sir. I didn't do it for money. Just glad I could help. Henry froze, the money still extended in his hand. He watched in stunned silence as Jason slung his backpack over his shoulder, gave a small wave, and started walking back down the road. For a long moment, Henry stood there, holding the money, staring at the shrinking figure of the boy. He couldn't remember the last time someone had done something for him without expecting something in return. As Henry climbed back into his SUV and continued his drive, Jason's face stayed with him. The calm confidence, the humility, and the refusal to accept payment. It felt different. It felt real. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt tales. Now, let's see what happens next. Part 2. Searching for Jason. That evening, Henry sat in his lavish downtown penthouse, surrounded by polished wood, leather furniture, and an impressive skyline view. But despite the luxury, the space felt cold, silent, and hollow. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out at the glittering city lights. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop thinking about Jason. There was something about the boy's genuine kindness that stirred something in Henry, something he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Henry canceled his meetings and climbed back into his SUV. He was going to find Jason. He didn't know what he'd say or even what he'd do, but he knew he couldn't just let the moment pass. Driving back along the same dusty road, Henry asked at gas stations, diners, and roadside shops. Most people shook their heads, but finally, an older woman at a small cafe spoke up. You might be talking about Jason Keller. Lives out in the old Keller farm with his mom. It's just a couple of miles down that way. Following her directions, Henry found himself in front of a modest farmhouse, paint peeling from the walls, and an old tire swing swaying gently in the breeze. The front porch was cluttered with garden tools and a broken lawn chair. Henry hesitated at the door before knocking. After a moment, the door creaked open, and a woman in her late 30s appeared. She looked tired but kind, her hair pulled into a loose bun. Can I help you? Hi, I'm Henry Callahan. I believe your son Jason helped me yesterday with a flat tire. Her face softened instantly. That sounds like Jason. He's always helping someone. Come on in. Inside, the house was humble but clean, with worn furniture and faded curtains. The smell of homemade bread lingered in the air. Jason emerged from a side room, his eyes lighting up in recognition. Hey, mister. You found us. Henry smiled warmly. I had to, Jason. I couldn't stop thinking about yesterday. They sat in the living room, where Jason's mother, Anna, served iced tea. They chatted about life on the farm, about Jason's dreams of becoming an engineer, and about the struggles they faced to keep their small farm afloat. Henry's heart ached as he listened. Here was a family with so little, yet they carried themselves with more grace and warmth than most people Henry had met in boardrooms filled with millionaires. You've raised an incredible son, Anna, Henry said sincerely. And Jason, you're one in a million, kid. Jason blushed slightly but grinned. Anna wiped a tear from her eye, her voice trembling. Thank you, Mr. Callahan, but we do what we can with what we have. Henry sat back, staring at the cracks in the walls, the sagging porch visible through the window, and the determination in Anna's eyes. He made a decision. I'd like to help you, not out of pity, not as charity, but because it's the right thing to do. Anna started to protest, but Henry held up a hand. Please, let me do this. Part 3. Building a Better Future. Over the next month, Henry kept his promise. Contractors arrived at the Keller farm, repairing the roof, fixing the plumbing, painting the walls, and reinforcing the foundation. New appliances were installed in the kitchen, and Jason's small room was furnished with a sturdy desk and a comfortable bed. Henry visited often, overseeing the work but also spending time with Jason. They'd sit on the porch swing, sipping lemonade and talking about Jason's dreams of building machines that could help farmers like his family. When the renovations were complete, the Keller farmhouse stood proud, a beacon of hope and resilience. On the final day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry handed Jason an envelope. This isn't just money, Jason. It's a scholarship fund. Use it to follow your dreams. Go to school, learn, build. Jason's hands shook as he took the envelope, his eyes wide with gratitude. Thank you, Mr. Callahan. I promise I won't waste this chance. Henry smiled, his voice steady. I know you won't, Jason. As Henry drove away from the farmhouse for the last time, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. A profound sense of peace. It wasn't about wealth, success, or deals. It was about connection. It was about giving back. It was about doing something that mattered. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Remember, kindness doesn't cost a thing, but it can change everything. Love.
An 18-year-old walked into a car dealership with his own money, ready to buy his first car. They kicked him out without thinking twice. The next day, his billionaire mother arrived and made sure they never forgot his name. Omari Thorne had his whole day planned. It was a late Thursday morning in Smyrna, Tennessee. The air felt thick and heavy, like a summer storm was coming. Omari didn't care. He wore a gray jacket, black cargo pants, and old white sneakers. Under his arm was a blue folder with 5 printed listings for used hybrid cars, all under $15,000 and with good mileage. He wasn't there to show off, just to prepare for his new life. Omari had just graduated from a top high school in Murfreesboro and got into Georgia Tech's engineering program. He wanted a reliable car for the long drives to and from campus. Nothing fancy, just something that wouldn't break down on the highway. When he walked into Crestview Motors, a small but flashy dealership, he was calm and focused. He even held the door open for a woman leaving. She smiled at him, but the receptionist didn't. "Can I help you?" she asked, not looking up from her computer. "Yeah, I'm here to check out some hybrids you have listed," Omari said, lifting the folder. "I printed them out. There are a few Sonatas and a Civic." The woman blinked slowly. "Are your parents with you?" "No, ma'am. I'm buying it myself." She gave him a stiff smile and waved toward the lot. "Someone will be out soon." But no one came. Omari waited by the door, glancing outside. He saw the Civic he wanted, the same one from the listing. He took a step toward it, but stopped when a tall salesman in a red polo shirt blocked his path. "You lost?" the man asked, holding a clipboard but not reading it. His eyes fixed on Omari's clothes and shoes. "No, I'm here to buy a car," Omari repeated, holding out the folder. The salesman didn't look at it. "This isn't a place to hang around if you're not serious. We've had problems lately." "Problems?" Omari asked, confused. "People coming in, looking at cars they can't afford, taking pictures, causing trouble. You get it." Omari's stomach twisted, but he stayed calm. "I printed the listings. I'm not taking pictures. I just want to test drive one." The man forced a laugh. Come back with a parent or someone who can discuss financing. I don't need a parent. I'm paying cash. It's my money, Omari said. I already talked to my bank. Look, the man said, stepping back. I'm not trying to be rude, but people get ideas. Right now, I don't have time for this. Omari didn't move. He just stared, his folder now damp in his hands. So you want me to leave? I'm saying we're busy today. You can return another time. Or, better yet, try one of the used car shops down the street. They might have something more in your budget. That was it. Omari didn't fight, didn't yell. He just glanced at his folder, then at the Honda Civic across the lot, and gave a small nod, not to agree, but to show he understood. He turned, walked to his car, and left. But the workers at Crestview Motors didn't know who Omari Thorne really was. On the drive home, Omari didn't play music, just silence and the soft sound of windshield wipers as rain began to fall. He wasn't the type to shout or break things. He thought quietly, sometimes too quietly. He took the longer route, passing the old park where he used to bike race with his cousin Elijah. He drove by the small library, its windows still covered with last summer's reading contest posters. The streets were the same. The quiet was the same. But this time, everything felt different, like the road beneath his tires wasn't as steady as before. When he got home, he sat in his car for a moment, hands on the wheel, watching the raindrops on the glass. Inside, the house smelled like lavender and coffee, his mom's favorite scents. She always said they made her feel in control of her day. Omari took off his shoes without a word. He went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and poured water. Upstairs, Dr. Ayanna Thorne was on a work call. Omari could hear her voice, calm, clear, and sure. She was the kind of person who could speak to top doctors one day and take care of her son the next. When she came down later, she found him on the couch with his laptop and folder. "Find any good cars?" she asked. He paused. "I went to Crestview. They had some okay ones." She sat across from him. "Did you drive any?" "No." She tilted her head. "Why not?" "They told me to come back with a parent. Said I looked like I was just wasting time." He said it plainly, like he was listing items from a store. Ayanna pressed her lips together. Not in anger, just a pause. A careful pause. "Did something happen?" He shook his head. "It's whatever. I wasn't going to argue there, I just left." She studied him. "Did they say anything specific?" "Not really. Just acted like I didn't belong." Ayanna stayed quiet. She leaned forward, rested her hand on his knee for a moment, then stood and began putting away dishes from the sink. But her mind was elsewhere. Omari went back to his laptop, scrolling through car listings. His bank account was still open in another tab. He had enough money, he knew that, yet he'd never felt smaller. What he didn't know was that upstairs, Ayanna was already making moves. She wasn't the type to yell or make a scene. That wasn't her way. She believed in acting with precision. If she spoke up, it was because she had to. And when she did, people listened. That night, she called a friend who worked in property insurance, someone who had done business with Crestview Motors. Just a few questions. Who owned the place? How was it run? Who handled customers? By morning, she had all the information she needed. Omari was still asleep when she backed the Rolls-Royce out of the garage. She rarely drove it. It was more about meaning than use. A gift from a French drug company she'd worked with years ago. Once, she'd almost sold it, but her mother stopped her. "Sometimes, people need to see what success looks like," her mother had said, "especially the ones who think they already know." As the car rolled onto the road, the silver trim gleamed in the morning sun like quiet armor. But this wasn't about flaunting wealth. It was about making a point. At 9:30 a.m., the doors of Crestview Motors slid open. Same lobby. Same woman at the front desk, typing away, eyes glued to her screen. But this time, it wasn't Omari. First, she noticed the car. A midnight blue Rolls-Royce Dawn, polished like glass, with Georgia plates. Not the kind of vehicle you usually see at a small-town dealership. Then, she saw the woman stepping out. Dr. Ayanna Thorne didn't need to speak to demand attention. She walked in wearing a navy suit, silent heels, and only a silver watch for jewelry. No smile, no anger, just quiet power. The kind that makes people sit up straighter without knowing why. "Good morning?" Ayanna spoke. The receptionist blinked. "Good morning. Are you here for a service appointment?" "No," Ayanna said, placing her bag softly on the counter. "I'd like to speak with the manager." "Sure, one moment." The receptionist grabbed the phone, dialing quickly. Her eyes darted to the car outside. Less than a minute later, a man appeared. Mid-40s, neat dress shirt, a Bluetooth earpiece in one ear. He looked like he was always wrapping up a call. "I'm Dan Grisson, the general manager," he said, holding out his hand. "What can I do for you today?" Ayanna didn't shake his hand. "You spoke to my son yesterday, 18 years old, black, quiet, wore a windbreaker, brought printouts of cars. You told him to leave." Dan's face twitched, but he kept his polite smile. "Ma'am, I see a lot of people. Maybe there was a mix-up." Ayanna opened her bag, took out Omari's blue folder, and laid it on the counter. "He came in with this. He showed your staff exactly which cars he wanted. He had his loan ready. He could have paid in cash. But he left without even driving one. Know why?" Dan's smile faded. "No need to turn this into a fight." "It's not a fight," Ayanna said calmly. "It's facts." Dan sighed. "Look, if he felt unwelcome, I'll personally help him next time. I can show him our stock myself." "That won't be needed." Dan frowned. "Then, how do I fix this?" Ayanna picked up the folder, opened it, and held up one of the listings. "You see this Honda Civic? Your team said it was too expensive for him. You assumed he couldn't afford it. You didn't know who he was. But that's not the worst part." She set the paper down gently. "The worst part is, even if he was just a hopeful kid with no money, he still deserved respect." Dan shifted, finally looking away. Ayanna reached into her bag again and pulled out a single business card. The car was dark black, with raised letters showing her name in shiny silver. Dr. Ayanna Thorne, CEO of Oratech Biolabs. "Next time a young man comes in that prepared," she said, "ask for his name before judging his worth. You never know who you're rejecting." For a moment, the room froze. The receptionist stopped typing. A salesman by the door halted. Ayanna locked eyes with Dan. "Just so you're clear," she added, "I didn't come because my son asked me to. He didn't even want me here. He told me to let it go. But that's the difference between us. He forgives, I remind." Dan's throat tightened. Ayanna adjusted her bag and turned to leave. "Oh, and the car outside," she said, glancing back. "Not for sale. Just making a point." She walked out without waiting for a reply. But the talk inside wasn't over. Not for Dan, or anyone who'd seen her. Dan stood still for half a minute after the door shut. His ears burned, not from shame, but from understanding. He wasn't new to this job. He knew when someone wanted drama and when they spoke the truth. And Dr. Thorne had brought the truth. Behind him, the receptionist whispered, "Was that her son yesterday?" "The kid Dan didn't answer. In his office, he sat, clicked his pen, and stared at his desk. Then, He called in the salesman who'd turned Amari away, the same man in the red Crestview polo. "Chris, shut the door," Dan said. Chris looked nervous. "What's up?" "Remember that kid from yesterday? Black teen, asked about hybrids." Chris nodded. "Yeah, the one near the Civic." Dan folded his hands. He wasn't just hanging around. He had papers, listings, and a loan ready. His mother came today. Chris smirked. "Okay, but he looked like—" Dan interrupted. "He looked like what?" Chris hesitated, mouth half open but silent. Dan leaned back. "Ever think we don't get many black buyers here because they walk in, see how we treat them, and leave?" Chris shifted in his seat. "It's not like that." "You sure?" Dan asked. "She didn't shout or demand free things. She just wanted us to know who we dismissed, not because he couldn't afford it, but because we assumed he couldn't." Chris stared at the floor. Dan pointed outside. "Every week, we blame online sales and time wasters. But maybe we're the problem, judging people before they speak." Chris stayed quiet, likely remembering all the other young men he'd turned away with the same weak excuses. Meanwhile, back at home, Omari was still in bed, earbuds in, watching a video about solar-powered batteries. His morning was calm. He had no idea his mother had gone back to the place that turned him away, but he didn't need to know. She hadn't gone there for praise. She did it because she'd seen this happen before. As Ayanna drove home, old memories came back, not from anger, but from experience. When she was 24, working in a pharmacy lab in Columbus, Ohio, a supplier thought she was just an intern. At 30, she pitched her first artificial blood idea to a room of men. They only looked at her white business partner. Once, on a discussion panel, someone asked if she was the advertising person. No matter how many degrees she had, some people only saw what they wanted to see. She wasn't trying to shield Omari from this truth. She couldn't. But she could make sure, the next time someone judged him, they remembered her words. That afternoon, while Ayanna was in a Zoom meeting in her home office, Dan from Crestview Motors sent a staff memo. It wasn't a big speech, just a reminder about treating every customer with respect, no matter how they looked. He knew it wouldn't solve everything, but it was a start. He didn't do it because he feared bad press or a lawsuit. Ayanna hadn't threatened anything. She had just spoken the truth, plain and strong, in a way that couldn't be ignored. And the one who needed to hear it most wasn't even there. Ayanna hadn't always been the kind of woman who could walk into a car shop and silence men mid-sentence. That kind of confidence wasn't born. It was built. Through struggle. Through hurt. Through refusing to look away. She remembered being a quiet girl in Birmingham, standing in line for free school meals. Her mother cleaned offices at night. Her father left when she was 6. While other kids skipped class to smoke, she read science books from the library. People called her too serious when she stayed quiet, and too bold when she spoke up. So she focused on one thing, building something no one could take from her. When most kids were sleeping late on weekends, Ayanna made her son wake up early. Not to make him suffer, but to show him the real world, not just the safe space she had built. She taught him when to speak up and when to walk away. So when he came home quiet the day before, she wasn't shocked. He had learned to control his anger. Not because he was weak, but because she raised him to know that sometimes silence speaks louder than rage. What hurt her most was how easily he accepted it. Not because he didn't care, but because he was used to it. That thought stayed with her all day. Her son, with his near-perfect grades, his early acceptance to a top tech school, and his calm personality, had already accepted being treated like a threat. Ayana remembered when he was 10. A neighbor called the police, reporting a strange boy walking through yards. That boy was Omari, coming home from basketball practice with his gym bag and science project. She remembered the police car pulling up and Omari sitting on the curb, not scared or confused, just tired. She never told him, but that night she started looking into security systems, not to keep others out, but to protect him from being misunderstood. She knew the world wouldn't always give her son the kindness she fought for. That's why she taught him to move like water, strong, flexible, but calm. That's why he didn't argue at the car dealership, and that's why she did. Later, Omari came downstairs with his backpack and asked, "Do you still have that list of better dealerships?" Ayana handed him her phone without a word. The note was still there. Better options. He scrolled and stopped at one. "Think this place will take me seriously?" Ayana paused. "They'd better." Omari gave a small smile, but his eyes changed. He wasn't angry, just more aware. But neither knew someone else had been watching their story closely. The next morning at Crestview Motors felt different. No big meeting, no announcement, but the air had changed. The sales floor, usually loud with fake smiles, was quieter. Not silent, but thoughtful. Dan, the manager, had made a decision that morning. Staring at his reflection while shaving, he realized he'd messed up. Not just with the boy, but with the whole workplace culture. He'd let a toxic mindset grow, one that cared more about appearances than fairness, one that judged before listening. He arrived early and saw Chris by the Civic, the same car Omari wanted to test drive. Dan pointed at it. "Get this one fully checked today. Tires, battery, everything." Chris nodded. "You think the kid's coming back?" "No," Dan said. "But it's not about him anymore. It's about what we do next." Meanwhile, Ayana had already moved on. She didn't dwell, post about it, or call the news. That wasn't her goal. She hadn't gone there for attention or anger. She went to calmly remind them that their mistakes had results. Her mother's words came back to her that morning as she drank coffee on the porch. Some folks only see what they choose to, until you show them what they overlooked. Omari, meanwhile, was already messaging a worker from another car shop across town. One that answered his questions online without hesitation. One that didn't pause when he asked about paying with cash. He wasn't hurried. He knew what he needed and what he wouldn't accept. Later, Ayana got a call from an unknown number. She nearly ignored it, but curiosity won. "Dr. Thorne, this is Dan Grissom from Crestview Motors." She stayed quiet. "I know you didn't ask for anything," he went on, "but I wanted you to know we spoke to our team. We're changing how we deal with walk-ins, especially young ones. We're starting a training program on bias next month. It's not everything, but it's a start." Ayana didn't say thanks, not to be rude, but to be clear. "Make sure it lasts," she said. "I will," he replied. Then he added, "And tell your son. He made more of a mark than he likely realizes." After the call, Ayana stood in her kitchen, phone in hand. She didn't need praise, but the talk settled something in her. Not just because they admitted they were wrong, but because they finally wanted to improve. That night, Omari walked in holding a car key. "Think I'll take the Sonata," he said. Ayana looked up from her laptop. "From the second place?" He nodded. The guy there explained everything. No odd vibes, just facts. Felt different. She smiled. "You like it?" "Yeah. Not fancy, but reliable." "That's you," she said. He paused. "Did you say something to them?" She leaned back. "I had a talk." He raised an eyebrow. "A serious one?" "I wasn't there to shout," she said. just to show them what they missed. Omari took that in, then grinned. "Thanks." Ayanna shrugged. "You thanked me by staying true to yourself." What they both knew, without saying it, was that silence isn't weakness. It's a plan. And sometimes the strongest message is the quietest. A week later, the car sat in their driveway, still shiny from the shop. Omari had driven it around town, getting used to it. He liked how it felt. Smooth, steady, no flash, just function. He didn't bring up Crestview again, not because he forgot, but because it didn't control the outcome. The lesson had sunk in, like water into earth. Ayanna saw it in small ways, how he held himself in public, how he checked his money before buying, how he asked if he should dress up when helping his cousin shop for a truck. He wasn't pretending. He was adapting, like she had many times before. They didn't need deep talks. Their chats lived in the gaps. A look across the room, a nod when something hard was understood without words. One evening, as Omari helped his cousin practice parking, Ayanna sat at her desk, reviewing papers. Her eyes landed on a photo taped to her screen. Omari at 9, holding a science fair prize, grinning in an oversized shirt. Behind him was their old Honda, the one she'd driven for years. What made her smile wasn't the award. It was the hope in his eyes. He'd always had promise. Now he had proof, not of riches or payback, but of knowing himself, no matter what others assumed. Days later, she got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note. "We're better now because someone showed us why we had to be. Thank you. Crestview Motors." She folded it and tucked it away, not to remember them, but to remember that people can change when they're made to see what they've ignored. That night, she told Omari about the note. He chuckled. "Guess they finally got it." Ayanna smiled. "You got it long ago?" He shrugged. "Still feels good, though." She laughed. "Yeah, it does." Outside, the sun dipped behind the houses, stretching shadows over the driveway. Omari stood by the car, arms crossed, just looking at it. Then he got in, started the engine. No music, just motion. No one watching but those who mattered. In that moment, it was clear. He didn't just get a car. He got something deeper. Self-respect. Understanding. The knowledge that quiet strength speaks louder than noise. That how the world sees you doesn't decide how you see yourself. That sometimes the real power is walking away without losing your voice. Stories like Omari's happen every day. Not all have a fancy car rolling in, but each holds a chance for us to stop, rethink, and see people fully before judging them. If this story touched you, if it made you think or reminded you of someone, share it. Let others feel it too. And don't forget to follow. More stories like this are coming, ones that speak softly but clearly.